In this next part of our coverage of the Unification Wars, we look at how Luna was taken back from the cults that ruled there, and how one of those cults allied with the Emperor. He wanted them because they had superior gene forgers, and then we touch on a number of shorter examples from those wars. Timestamps in the description for your ease of use, and now, let's begin. The first pacification of Luna was the first operation mounted by elements of the Legiones Astartes beyond the skies of Terra. The wars of unity below were still raging. Luna was the bastion of a conglomeration of resurrectionist gene cults, the members of these cults believing that human nature was both fractal, fractured, and transcendent. To them, the true nature of mankind was visible in the flesh and mind of the individual, and that each person was an echo of the archetypes that persisted throughout human existence. Each cult clung to a different set of archetypes. Some represented them as anthropomorphic figures, some as numbers, and some as symbolic systems, shot through with low occultism. Most fell short of deification, but all pursued understanding through their craft of gene forging. Each cult member was a product, not of random breeding, but creation by the cult gene rights, according to the formula born in the dark age of technology. Resurrected in body, time and time again, they attempted to reach a true personification of a single archetype. In their subterranean complexes, the cults were powerful, insular, and resistant to the imperial truth. Such resistance was hardly a novelty, and would normally have been dealt with in the usual manner, by obliteration. The fact that the gene cults had something that the growing Imperium needed complicated that position. Clouded as it might have been by occultism, the genecraft of the Selenar lunar cults was unqualified save within the Emperor's own facilities. With Terra teetering on the edge of complete unification, the conquest of the Sol system and the galaxy beckoned. For that crusade, there would need to be more and more space marines. The Terran facilities could not be able to cope with such a huge increase to the creations of recruits for the legions, so the Imperium needed Luna's wealth of genecraft and capacity added to its own. But the Selenar gene cults would not bow willingly to the hunger of the newborn Imperium, and had fought off the machinations of Terran warlords and Martian Magos. In the past, the Selenar had received Imperial ambassadors with courtesy, but answered their offers with threats and entreaties, and often silence. As the threats began to outnumber the offers, the lunar cults began to turn away the ambassadors, and the idea then was to gird themselves for war. Normally highly factional, the possibility of Terran domination overcame all doctrinal disagreements between the cults, matriarchs and gene rights. They would resist the Imperium together, and without limit. The final Imperial deputation to Luna was returned to Terra as a still screaming soup of fused liquid flesh in the dead shell of their shuttle. So it was that the Emperor ordered the lunar cults to be pacified, their beliefs broken and their craft yoked to the needs of the Imperium. It could be no simple conquest by destruction. The gene forgers had to remain intact, as did the cult gene rights that mastered them. A single blow had to cut away the cult's beliefs and their will to resist. To this task the Emperor set 3 of his legions, most suited to his purpose, on what some chroniclers name as the first true battle of the Great Crusade. The Sons of Horus had been chosen for the force's vanguard, operating in full strength, free of Terra's pull. Their assault craft cut their power ice cold and silent, to mask themselves from detection, set to drift towards the silver disk of Luna like arrows fired into the night. Only space marines clad as they were in suit-sealed armour could have enacted such a plan and lived. Within the void-cold interiors of each craft, the warriors of the Sons of Horus waited in the airless dark, their armour rimed with ice. Behind them came a smaller wave of craft carrying elements of the Ultramarines and the Imperial Fists, their engines burning and their skins glittering with void shields. This second wave was the show of might that the gene cults expected, and the perfect distraction from the first. Fire filled the space between Terra and its only moon. Weapon systems embedded in Luna's surface lashed the oncoming assault force. But even as the guns fired, the Sons of Horus assault craft, unlooked for and unseen, struck their targets like a dagger in the night. The previous ambassadors sent to Luna had not been of a total waste. By the time the Sons of Horus Legion's assault craft slipped the gravity of Terra, the location of each defensive battery and cult leader was known, and the Sons of Horus hit each with overwhelming force, smashing aside defences and breaching the tunnel complexes below, regardless of what half-machine monsters of the Selenar's genecraft were thrown against them, and they had been able to do this because of the ambassador's information. And it is said that those looking up at the night sky of Terra could see the face of Luna glitter with flames. The defence batteries fell within seconds, the corridors of their silos running with blood from the slaughter. Of the 100 or more cult leaders scattered across Luna, most died without realising they were under direct assault. Those that did not die fled as hulking warriors in pale grey armour smashed into their refuges and gutted them of life. Without defence systems and the direction of their leaders, the Selenar cult could do nothing as more Space Marines attacked. They landed and began to systematically break their remaining strongpoints and isolate pockets of resistance. Within a mere 6 hours of the first shot being fired, Luna was pacified. Faced with annihilation, the surviving Selenar bent the knee instead, their surrender communique calling for the Emperor to call off his wolves. Broken and humbled, the enslaved gene rights of Luna would help forge the next generation of Legiones Astartes and fuel the conquest of the stars. Now we examine the Achaemenid Empire. They were very wealthy. The kings of the empire were allies with the Master of Mankind. This alliance spared them the horrors of atomic war or the invasion of the Thunder Warriors. Ahriman of the Thousand Suns was brought up in that place. I mention this as he has an interesting observation about the Thunder Warriors, within whose bodies the Emperor had implanted full-grown biological hardware and mechanical augmentations to boost their strength, endurance and speed. They were monstrous things, and most were eventually driven insane by the demands their enhanced physiques made upon them. The biological heritage of the people of this area was not contaminated like the flaws and viral defects that inflicted many of the other Earth tribes, so the Emperor walked among the populace with his army of scientists, testing each and every family, grouping for the required genetic markers. The people of that place, including Ahriman, was recruited to the Astartes. They were each given a talisman that represented the strength of the greatest ruler of that empire. The charm was to keep them safe. The people of this empire were also taught to value truth above all else, to hunt and kill and debate if you were the sons of royalty. And, in a further part to the Unification Wars, we have a conflict which is basically one line in a Custodes Codex, and it says that in Atlan, the Ur Queen was killed by the Custodes. A long holdout against the future Master of Mankind was High Brasil. By the time the Imperium was being built, Lord Ferrum Siccar was hereditary Lord of High Brasil, the most powerful of all these sub-American cantons. Siccar had often been vocal in his criticism of imperial policies. His dynastic links, through bloodline and marriage, to the Navis nobility provided him with a considerable trade empire off Terra. Siccar was reckoned to be one of the most powerful feudal lords of the colonies. Only the most careful political gamesmanship by Malcador the Sigillite had prevented Siccar's elevation to the Lords of Terra and the power that would bring. This concern and his exclusion from that position came as he was a direct descendant of Dalmoth Kin, one of the last tyrants to hold out against the Emperor's forces in the dying days of the Unification Wars. It was understood that the Emperor tolerated Siccar's rule of High Brasil and his barracking and sniping in the hegemon in order to heal the old wounds left by the Wars of Unification and encourage ethnic settlement. Siccar was a powerful man and both an articulate person and statesman. He often spoke tolerable sense. His policies were pragmatic and robust. His opposition to imperial directives was not so fierce it required him to be placed under house arrest, like Lady Calhoun of Lanark, or be removed from office entirely and charged with treason to the imperial state, like Hans Gargetten, Chancellor of the Atlantic platforms. But Siccar was always to be handled with caution. With his military campaigns completed, the Master of Mankind wanted to spread the imperial truth across Terra. for mankind to embrace science and atheism. He destroyed churches in line with this. The final church standing on Terra is the Church of the Lightning Stone. The priest there once fought against the Emperor. At the battle, the human army against the Emperor was 50,000 strong, and they faced less than a tenth of the forces under the Big E. They felt they could win. They charged from the hillside like mad, glorious fools, screaming war cries and waving swords, pistols and rifles above their heads. The Emperor's forces did not move as the charge happened. When those who opposed the Emperor got close, his forces opened fire. With that thunderstorm, the rebels' first 5 ranks were cut down to a man. The fallen didn't even have time to scream before death greeted them. The Emperor's forces tore limbs from bodies or simply burst men apart like wet sacks. The charge had ground to a halt. Men and women milled around in confusion and fear as they suddenly understood the reality of what the rebel leader Havelek had begun. The Thunder Warriors put up their guns and marched towards us, unsheathing swords with serrated edges and motorized blades that roared like something stepping from nightmare. The rebel leader Havelek fell dead in the middle of the field. The lower half of his body had been blown clean off. The army begged for mercy. Even when they threw down their weapons, the Thunder Warriors did not stop. Those begging were hacked down. The fallen forces were cut apart and brutalized with economy of force. It was a mechanized butcher, and the priest is unable to stop the fall of the last church, his church, on Terra. In a brief part of his Terran campaign, next up we have Adedeji, which ruled an area of ancient Terra, which would be around the approximate area of North Africa in our world. When the master mankind came to their doorstep, they resisted his will, his coming, and so they were made low and made to become factory workers. And generations later, this is still the case. Many powers had tried to resist the Emperor. Some, like the ruling family of Boeotia, had held out for decades, negotiating and conniving their way around treaties and rapprochements and every other diplomatic tool and effort designed to bring them under imperial sway. The story demonstrated that the Emperor, or his advisors at least, possessed extraordinary patience. In the wake of the Unification War, there had been a strenuous and high-profile effort to resolve conflicts through non-violent means, and the Yselti were not tyrants or despots. They were simply an ancient royal house eager to maintain their autonomous existence. The Emperor allowed them a twilight grace of a century and a half to come to terms, longer than the lifespan of many Terran empires. The story also demonstrated that the Emperor's patience was finite, and that when it was exhausted, so was his mercy and restraint. The imperial army had advanced into Boeotia to arrest the Yselti and annex the territory. They were followed by the Thousand Sons to wrap up and complete things, to end their opposition. The first use that the Emperor put his Night Lords to was to bring to heel those who believed that the sins of the past could live on in the new Imperium. Several of those who had bent their knee to the Emperor had done so because they believed that it was the only choice. Others, having seen the empires of warlords rise and fall, believed that they were simply part of a temporary arrangement. Crimes against the new order took many faces, from the Saragorn Enclave, whose gene atrocities continued in secret, to the cyber-breeding of the court of Antius and the march of 10 million, all showed that even in the face of all the Emperor's might, some would fall back into the ways of old night. When such crimes required not simply crushing, but retribution, the Emperor sent the Night Lords Legion. Such actions seemed very well suited to the Night Lords, whether as a consequence of their genetic inheritance or the combination of their origins and indoctrination. The warriors of the Legion seemed to have tended towards moral absolutism and a drive to enact retribution. There were no shades of grey in their moral universe, no degrees of guilt or innocence. Truth and falsehood was as day to night, indivisible and unqualified. The dark was the realm of guilt, lies and monsters, and those who dwelt in the dark knew only the language of blood, the message of swift and merciless retribution for their actions. Justice brought the light to darkness, and justice was neither warm nor caring, but as indifferent and cold as the edge of a knife. The warriors of the Night Lords were creatures made to live in the dark and to fight a war for a future of light. In their core, they were warriors for a future without creatures of their kind. At least that is what those who knew them now say. Perhaps memory is too kind. Perhaps we wish to believe that there is a nobility in such monsters, where in fact there is only horror. Perhaps we wish there to be a purpose behind atrocity. Otherwise, how could such creatures be suffered to live? And unleashed on the Saragorn Enclave, it is the Night Lords that destroy viciously this opponent to the Emperor's might. An area called Oxitania was ruled by the King Gotha. They opposed the Emperor, but were defeated, but this cost the lives of almost all the Night Lords to achieve this. Gotha after was one of the first to accept the rank of a rogue trader. In return, his sentence of execution was commuted. The Yndonesic Bloc was ruled over by Cardinal Tang. He was the tyrant, the ethnarch, and he ruled throughout the Age of Strife and the Unification Wars as well. He used faith as his unifying weapon. After he came to power, Tang imposed a horrible regime on the islands in the bloc. He made sure those citizens considered compatible on a genetic level were together. If a child was considered genetically inferior, they would be removed from further using the bloc's resources. When the Emperor launched his war, Tang was his enemy for a long time, holding many fortress zones, when the rest of Terra was under the dominion of the first and last Lord of the Imperium. When the last bastion belonging to Tang was taken, Tang himself was captured alive and locked up in a penal colony of Nusa Kambangan, which later became a hive. He only lasted a few days until inmates learned his identity and murdered the former warlord. In Albyon, a warlord, Yulian the Red, is beaten by a rival Kabuka's forces and locked in a prison, where Kabuka himself would eventually end up later, we are told. They knew it simply as the Vault. Khangba Marwu had always been part of the mountain, or at least so it seemed to those who even knew of it. It had always been a site of incarceration, a hidden place to cage the most violent, the most dangerous and the most reprehensible evils the world had known. No one knew who had first hacked its cells and passageways from the bedrock of the mountain, but its origins went far beyond the limits of memory and surviving documentation. Stories of the criminals incarcerated in its lightless depths stretched back thousands of years, their names now meaningless and their crimes long forgotten. Yet there were villains aplenty plucked from living memory, who had darkened its sterile corridors and died insane within its unfeeling walls. The lieutenants of the Pan-Pacific tyrant had been brought here, as had the ethnarch of the Caucasus Wastes, the so-called First Emperor, and a being known only as the Reaper, a monster that legend said was an angel sent to cleanse mankind from the world. Yulian the Red, the tyrannical, blood-drinking prince of Albyon, had been brought here for execution after his defeat at the Battle of the Blue Dawn. Yulian's debased followers conquered a quarter of the globe, but were finally halted by an army of powerful warriors, raised by a Nordafric warlord known as Kabuka, who was said to have called lightning from the clouds and granted his warriors superhuman strength. In time, Kabuka himself was hauled in chains to the vault, but no history remained to tell of who had overturned his rule. A persistent rumour told that the Emperor himself had designed a cell especially for Nathan Doom, but which had gone unused following the tyrant's death during the final battle to bring down his inhuman regime. Whispers maintained it had been the urging of Constantine Valdor that saw Durm executed in the ruins of his empire, a half-mad, half-genius psychopath deemed too dangerous to live. Cardinal Tang had been bound for this specialised jail, but like Durm, he never saw the inside of his cell. Inmates who had suffered the worst tortures imaginable in his bloody pogroms broke open his isolation tank and tore his body apart with their bare hands before his transit from Nusa could be arranged. Let me know your thoughts on this part of the Unification Wars with a comment below, and if you like this 40k video I did, why not try this one?